So again, using that same swim lane format and looking at the right-hand side is an effort to capture the scope of change with respect to each particular swim lane. First one, again, is smart meters, where the focus is in rolling out infrastructure. The nature of your customer interaction has changed, particularly if you're deploying a customer portal. You're probably deploying more knowledge applications, not just around outage analysis, but probably revenue protection, asset optimization. You're addressing issues on governance. Historically, meter to cash was a part of the business function. The question raises is how does that change once the process is automated. But the point is that this swim lane is typically focused on the meter to cash and the customer part of the business. When you move on into smart grid or grid optimization, the focus changes to hard network and network assets, workflows associated with those assets, new processes to manage data real time and analytics associated with that, and also looking at potential integration of operating models, particularly transmission, distribution, and generation. And the final swim lane focuses on the question raised in the prior slide. Does my business model change? Does my customer strategy and my behaviors towards customer change, and to what degree? What new relationships do I have with third parties? And will the organization be able to engage in innovative and collaborative business practices at market speed? We could debate the scope of change in either of those or any of those swim lanes, but I hope what's been demonstrated in these two slides is that, in fact, a smart grid AMI implementation has a capacity to change every component of the business. And I think Sue's going to drill down on that in the next couple of slides.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bernie. And I think what, in addition to that, the point that Bernie just made is that the different focus or your in-state strategy ultimately has the ability to impact the organization differently. And so having a point of view, having that perspective, that long-term vision, both because it may assist in messaging externally to your customers or to other external stakeholders, but also because it helps to really articulate that journey, if you will, the suite of different kinds of changes that the organization will go through. So what we're showing on this slide is really an aggregation of the learnings that we've extracted from a number of different programs out there, and trying to show, so you'll see down the left-hand side is really a broad grouping of the different stakeholder groups, if you will, the different employee groups, divisions, organizations within the utility, customer service, distribution, transmission, generation, etc. And then along the top are the different focus or the different in-state strategies. And obviously we recognize that this may seem a bit cut and dried, but really to illustrate that the changes are different, we recognize you could have strategies that tie a number of different things together. But and then in the middle, the Harvey balls, and we could have easily said high, medium, or low, but those Harvey balls are intended to illustrate the magnitude and complexity of change. And where did we get that from? We're really looking at what is there an effort difference? So for example, in a customer service function with a potentially different volumes of customer calls, does the effort within the call center ultimately change? We're also looking at the nature of the job itself, and you'll see in a follow-on slide also in the call center, are we asking the utility groups, right, the employees within the utility to ultimately take different roles and responsibilities that they did in the past? And we're seeing that play through quite a bit in spades, for example, in the IT function, also in customer service and the other places. The other thing we looked at was skill and knowledge. So this may be somewhat straightforward, but as new technology is rolled out, as the end-to-end process ultimately changes, what are the different capabilities, the skills, the knowledge, even contextually? For example, we could almost say that every employee within the utility ultimately is impacted and needs to be able to respond to a customer's inquiry that they run into someone in the grocery store. What is a smart grid? Because there is so much publicity in the marketplace. So ultimately that contextual knowledge needing to change. And then finally, new behaviors. Are we asking people to ultimately act differently than they did in the past? So what you're seeing here, really the conclusions that we've drawn, is that things are different. And for example, if your goal is ultimately to implement more of a smart grid approach, that may have less of a direct impact on your customer service function. Not to say there isn't an impact overall, but it may have less of an impact, obviously, than perhaps in transmission, distribution, IT, etc. And the second observation is that we're also seeing the impacts themselves are perhaps much different than we thought when we started seeing the smart metering implementations of a few years back. In particular, a couple examples. For example, I think there was probably a recognition of the extent to which these programs would ultimately impact the IT function. The IT organization ultimately in the past having been much more of a service provider. Today, that IT function is absolutely intimately tied to the execution, the movement of information on the grid. Not that they weren't, the IT and the systems weren't important in the past, but absolutely tied to our ability to deliver that energy and understand what's happening out there. A significant shift, perhaps, than I think we had thought, a few years back when some of the programs started underway. And then the third thing, and maybe not necessarily represented as well on this slide, but is the ongoing nature of change. So as these utilities are rolling out the program through their territory, it's not just one change, it's actually ongoing change to a number of these different organizations. So, these programs, whether they are 3 years, 5 years, and up, ultimately it is an ongoing impact. And so what Brian will cover off in the next section is how do you start to set that up and how do you start to address it? And our perspective is, now having seen this, the more you understand about your end state, the more you understand about what the organization is ultimately going to go through, the more prepared you are to set the right sequence and nature and different types of activities to ultimately address those impacts. So what I'm going to show here on the next slide